She also has experience in ministry as a partner of those who are caring for those with mental health. And of course, she's working on her doctorate to become a psychologist and therapist. For those of you who are watching online, thank you so much for being here. And we hope that as you listen, that this will be a place of encouragement and education for you. So Sally, would you come forward?
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, hello. Okay. Just want to make sure. Perfect. Okay, hello. Thank you so much for joining me today. Just like they mentioned, my name is Sally. I am a third-year graduate doctorate candidate at Azusa Pacific University. Just a little bit about my background. I had my undergrad degree in the arts at UCLA, and then I went to spiritual formation and soul care at Talbot, which is a seminary, and then I decided to go get my PsyD in clinical psychology. And so all of these kind of trajectories were based on my own reflection of my own life, my narrative, the things that felt just disturbed or I guess ruptured in my own understanding of my life and how I knew my family to be and my just previous generations. And so this topic comes a lot from, I guess, a lot of my personal growth. It stemmed from my personal interests, my own exploration in therapy. And yeah, so hopefully this is something that's practical to you. And like I said, I am a student, so this is like a very informative, but also you have to make the connections kind of presentation. And so I hope that is something that inspires you to do so. So let's begin. Intergenerational trauma. So intergenerational trauma is kind of a new front in the psychology world where they're finally starting to realize the experiences of a lot of minority populations and how kind of why there are some symptoms or mental health issues that people have, whereas there are not that many explanations as to why they have them. And so there's a lot of research being done right now, and so it's still, like I said, new. And so hopefully we get to talk a little bit about that research that has been happening. But just an overall education, adverse child events. So this trauma is also a very new subject as well, only 20, 30 years old, I think. And so they basically took a study and they saw that children who had adverse events such as traumas, forms of abuse, neglect, and trauma that is experienced under 18 years of age had significant impairment in their life functioning later on. And so the ACEs study, which was done in the 90s, showed that over half reported at least one ACE. So half the children they studied reported one ACE, and 1/4 reported 2 or more childhood traumas, which is a very significant number. So children are constantly being exposed to these harmful experiences and going through difficult challenges in their lives. They also found that exponential increase between number of ACEs and likelihood to develop adult health risk behaviors and disease was really high and correlated very strongly. And 4+ ACID had a 12 times increase of attempting suicide and a 4 times increase of depression symptoms. So as the number rises and the experiences that you've had, the more you're likely to develop diseases or just have mental health issues, which was a significant finding back in the day. They didn't realize that these things connected. And so all to say, the impact of childhood challenges continues and manifests in adulthood. And so I think a lot of us sitting here, as I say these things, it might spark in you a hard memory or just something that you've experienced in your life that you may have wanted to avoid or forget, but it's kind of arising. And so my hope is for you just to pay attention to these things because they are telling, but also just be kind to yourself and let it kind of pass by and to enjoy what I'm teaching rather than dwelling in those things, but just an invitation to join. So after they assessed ACEs, they decided to look at trauma. So like Dr. Bland said, trauma, a more extreme or pathological consequence of ACEs. And so I think the interesting thing about trauma is that some are actually really resilient. Like 2 people could experience the same trauma, but one person could not have negative symptoms, whereas one person can. And so a lot of that has to do with kind of your experiences, your community, your environment, your nurture, and your nature. So a lot of neuropsychology, your body responses. So there's many factors that go into how people experience trauma. But ultimately, it is a life-impairing event in your life, and it affects you. You have many symptoms, flashback nightmares, a lot of the things you see in movies, such as like PTSD of war veterans. Those are very common, well-known symptoms. But there's also little things like, just confusion in your daily life, difficulty concentrating, anger, irritability, anxiety and fear, guilt, even shame, withdrawing from others, feeling sad or hopeless, and also just feeling disconnected or numb. And so there's a lot of ways that trauma manifests and a lot of ways that aren't highlighted in Hollywood, but things to attend to as well. So this is our background. Oh, and also just want to talk about complex trauma. And so complex trauma is just kind of prolonged trauma exposure, where most people who have, ACEs, who have multiple ACEs, multiple adverse events, it just continually happens in their life. And so there's many layers to their experiences, right? So there's many different facets of trauma. And so what is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational trauma can happen historically, and it also can happen just within communities, world events, within populations. And so traumatic events that are shared by a group of people within a society, community, national group. And so I wanted to kind of discuss later on some things about the Holocaust, right? Genocides. My personal history is just as a Korean American, what happened in Korea's history that affects the way that I am today and affects my mental well-being as well. And so, like I said, intergenerational trauma is something that is passed down to subsequent generations through adverse historical events or just personal events as well. And also, when we talk about just historical trauma, there is a need to attend to the cultural trauma, right? Because a lot of shared culture is what happens in population groups and just people in general. And so cultural trauma, when bad things happen within a group of people, within a collective, it undermines their sense of group identity, values, meaning, and purpose, or their cultural worldviews. And so it affects not only the way that, people relate to one another, but law, politics, society, just their values and morals on how to go about life. And so we'll kind of dissect that more later on, but that's kind of how culture is affected by trauma as well. And there's neurological, biological, and somatic issues that are passed down as well. And so for Asian Americans, it's well known that they experience a lot of their symptoms through their body. And so we have more stomach aches or headaches, whereas people in other kind of populations experience more mentally or psychologically. And so those are kind of some differences that have, passed down into our generations. And also just social processes, right, of what it means to be a family, what community looks like and what society should look like, how people relate, that is changed. And there's new normals that happen when trauma is passed down through generations. So I wanted to look at our first case study. Oh, actually, yes. So this one is about the Holocaust. This is a more recent find of something that's been well researched. So in 1988, there was a study first published by the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry that revealed the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were still reporting high levels of anxiety, depression, and PTSD 2 full generations after the traumatic events occurred. And so that was a significant finding because they're in some ways not directly correlated with they never experienced those things that happened during the Holocaust. And yet they were reaping and just having all these symptoms that couldn't be explained. And so they found that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors generated from the survivors' experiences transmitted to their offspring. Right? Holocaust survivor mothers showed significantly more insecure attachment than non-survivor mothers. And so when we talk about insecure attachment, it's about attachment theory. It's something kind of that's well known, I guess, in media and in the psychology world. But basically, healthy, secure attachment means that a child is given all the basic needs. It needs to just go out and explore in the world, that they have a sense of safety and a sense of belonging wherever they go. But these children, they just had insecure attachments from their mothers because of what their mothers went through. And so Holocaust survivor offspring had higher incidences of mental health problems as well. And so this is kind of one of the things, and this population was perfect because it was within a certain group. There was a lot of control factors. And so I say all these things because I'm a student. I just have to consider all these things. But yes, they found that there was just so many direct correlations. And so it was really telling of this kind of research. And I wanted to kind of move into the kind of racism and slavery as well, because this is another high area of interest in research. So basically, what is the effect of racism and slavery in generational trauma. And what we experience right now in culture and the Black Lives Matter movement, all these things are so relevant that we're seeing now years later. And so the trauma that was experienced by ancestors have been passed down through each generation. This study was basically saying the same thing as well, due to just all the slavery and just the apartheid and I'm sorry, not apartheid, the diaspora of, just African cultures and their kind of experience of oppression in the United States, even after segregation was, lawfully ended and all these things. So there's always replicating circumstances that kind of provoke the same traumas, right? And so this author, doctor, and also psychologist, Dr. Joy DeGruy, she created this theory called the post-traumatic slave syndrome. And just a forewarning, it is a little controversial, the ideas that she portrays, but it was a really interesting attempt to construct and frame the unique histories and struggles of African Americans and Black people in our country. And so she found out three key things that they experienced due to intergenerational trauma. And so a common thread was self-esteem with feelings of hopelessness and depression. And so she noticed that a lot of negative racial stereotypes have been applied generationally. It was an instilled belief internally and externally by society. Persistent feelings of anger. So there was a lot of suspicion and reactivity amongst the Black and African American communities towards each other, towards the world. There was a lot of health outcomes, the development of physiological, psychological, emotional strain due to excessive amounts of energy, just this overload of stress, overload of anxiety. They saw that, most African Americans and Black people are high up in the charts and statistics for mental health illnesses that are somatic. And so they experience a lot of levels of stress, cortisol pumping, higher blood pressure. Schizophrenia is one of the highest diagnosed mental illnesses for people of color as well. And so all these kind of correlations were kind of directed back into the first generational trauma that these people experienced. And there's also just an internalization of stereotypes. So like I said, internalizing these negative self-beliefs that were held against them and within them, and they're turning against their own Black communities and escaping Blackism. So they're wanting to be like the majority culture or wanting to forgo their heritage because of this instilled belief that being this way was not good. And so this capitulation of oppression and racism that's happening in everyday society just further kind of reminded them and instills these beliefs that they have based on something that happened so many years ago. And so I wanted to also talk about kind of my own personal experience with passed down historical trauma as well. So I feel like Korean Americans, I am a Korean, Korean Americans have just the long historical trauma history. So basically happening with Japanese colonialism and just the Korean War. I noticed that, and my dad was actually a direct result. He was born right after the war ended. And so I saw that a lot of the ways he related, a lot of the ways that my dad and my mother dealt with stress were passed down to me. And the reason why I'm so close to maybe my Korean American community is because we have these shared beliefs that we have of towards mental health. There's a stigma about it. There's a way to deal with stress that isn't healthy, right? And so there's all these things that we're experiencing because of what happened so many years ago. And so that's just kind of a little bit of insight into just maybe an Asian American population. And I'm sure there's something different for each kind of group out there, and maybe in your own personal history as well. And so I guess, once again, just to invite you into that process of understanding and thinking critically of what could be my past that's stirring who I am today. I also wanted to go into kind of the body responses. Once again, I'm taking all these biology, psychobiology classes, and so this stuff is really interesting to me. So the genetic effects of intergenerational trauma. And so the brain development is hindered. Our limbic system, which is the emotional system in our brains, regulates mood. It heightens our amygdala activation. And so basically the amygdala is the place where fight, flight, or freeze happens. And so when people who are traumatized for generations, they have this ability to think or to react quicker than maybe other people who haven't. And so that's something they noticed that was different. Cortisol, like I mentioned, regulates the body's response to stress. And so there's differences between traumatized and non-traumatized parents. So the amount of cortisol, which is the circulation and activation of stress, is hindered or is kind of blown up out of proportion. Epigenetics showed that parental stress was passed down, right? Where pregnancy, the mothers who had kind of stress symptoms, it kind of transmitted into their DNA, and it got passed down to their children and their infants in utero. There was a study where moms who experienced 9/11 actually, who had trauma, PTSD from the event, had gene changes that made them more likely to react to stressful situations in a heightened response compared to other people. And so the children actually ended up developing these stress reactors as well. And so that's kind of like the more recent studies that we're seeing. There's also lower functionality of the methylation cycle, which helps operate physically and mentally. So this thing, it helps you operate your nervous system, your cardiovascular, your immune, your energy production, hormone balance. So all of this is just the mind and body connection, right? We're so intertwined, we're a whole person, and this is how it has affected us somatically and kind of internally and mentally. And the biggest study was that it changes, right? The intergenerational trauma changes the genetic expression. And so what that means is if our parents were in an environment of war, we can inherit a stress response that is more sensitive towards a situation that seems similar, though the same trauma doesn't happen. And so I think Dr. Bland was kind of mentioning how there is a fear in trauma. The fear is that it'll happen again, even if there's nothing that indicates that it will. And so that heightened sense was shown through a mice study. And so why mice, right? Mice, they actually have a 99% similar genome as us, as humans. And so we like to study them because not only do they have very similar genes, they also have, they cycle through their generations very quickly, whereas ours are prolonged for 20 years. Theirs is a much shorter lifespan. And so we can predict and see what might happen to us through them. And so they actually conducted a study where they made mice scared of a cherry blossom scent. So they gave them the smell and then they shocked them to scare them. And they found that their brains were enlarged in smell receptors that can detect the smell in less concentrations. And so they, not only were they kind of the classical conditioning, you know, the dog's saliva, if you hear a whistle, it like salivates. It was the same thing for these mice, but it changed their blood and their sperm and everything that was within their biological systems. And they saw in the next 2 generations of mice, in their pups and grandpups, that when they experienced the cherry blossom smell, they freaked out as if they were shocked, even if they weren't. And so these are kind of what we're seeing, the science is catching up to the theory in all this as well. And so they inherited the trauma response just like we do, and their symptoms actually worsened over time and developed something like depression in mice that we would experience as humans. And so there's so much science that's catching up to all this theory, and I think it's very exciting, but hopefully that kind of showcased, you know, where we're headed to really validating intergenerational trauma as an actual concept that's happening to minority populations. So further effects on wellness, these are just some things that, you know, beyond the somatic symptoms that happens, you know, emotional weight instability, relational issues, negative patterns or behavior, interpersonal issues, health risks. And as we look at these, some of us might realize, oh yeah, we're going through those things too, or I'm going through those things. And so maybe they might be indicators, you know, is there something that might be stirring up within you and kind of your brain is reminding you that something happened or that there's something that you need to attend to as well. And so what is the effect on families, right? And this is kind of the more practical element. A lot of it creates dysfunctional families. I wanted to go back to an imagery that I had. Oh, yes. So I found these awesome pictures on Google that really explained or illustrated generational trauma well. And if you look at the first one, it's kind of a specific case about the partition of India in 1947. But basically, all of those effects led down to kind of the parents experiencing the consequences of those historical events. So alcoholism, physical abuse, repressed anger, emotional abuse, untreated mental illness, codependency, and then that kind of transmitted to the next generation. So it's not in as heightened ways, but things that are kind of that most kids with secure attachment wouldn't really have to go through, or security in their mental health. So approval seeking, identity confusion, eating disorders, even depression, anxiety, alcoholism, etc., etc. And so it is like the cycle that unless it is stopped, it kind of keeps going passed down. And so the second one is just like another way to demonstrate the biological side of it and how the changes to our DNA could be passed down. And then the last one, I know it's hard to read, but it says unresolved emotions and thoughts about a traumatic event. So that is just a general, maybe not so extreme historical event, but something that's happened within a family. It leads to poor parent and child relationships and emotional attachment. And then it leads to the last generation having complicated personality traits or personality disorders. So we can see how in both extremes, many things could be passed down and have all these consequences. So when we talk about families, it also affects their parenting attitude and behavior. And I think that's kind of the main point that I wanted to get with families is that when you have unaddressed trauma and you're coping with in unhealthy ways, managing through, substance abuse or just anxiety or unable to talk it out, it affects every way that you parent and every way that you react to certain situations and you behave. And so even through this, kids can learned helplessness. And what that is, it's a way of thinking that leads to maladaptive behavior that, no matter what you do, nothing can be changed. You have a lack of control. Everything will always be as hard as it is now. And so these are kind of the traits that are happening within the family. And you also just have low self-esteem, distrust towards fellow human beings, pessimistic outlook on the world in general and on the future, if your dominant message is conveyed by this trauma, right? And you pass it on to your offspring. These days on Netflix, I'm watching, they're kind of dark, but Dahmer, which is a show based on this man who was a serial killer, and also this new Marilyn Monroe movie. She was as famous as she was also a very disturbed individual. And what I noticed in both of these shows and movie is that they always start with the family patterns that were kind of messed up. The mom had issues, a lot of child abuse, even sexual abuse, and it just perpetuates into what caused these individuals to be as broken or maladaptive as they are. And so I feel like media is really catching up to this idea that, the way that we're parented, it really starts in childhood. It really starts way back beyond ourselves and how we navigate the world as adults. Yes, maybe you have a movie or two that comes up in your mind, but that's what I'm seeing out there these days. And so what is the effect on communities, right? I think we're kind of moving outwards. We're starting with the inner person, and then we're moving into families and now communities. Like I said, it was a lot of this came because I was connecting with my Korean culture and realizing that there was a lot of even moments of depression or sadness that was happening within me that I couldn't explain. I had a lot of family issues as well growing up. It was a very broken family. But I think when I observed my parents' generation, it made good reason for the way that I was today. And so, like I said, the Korean War, Japanese colonialism, it really developed unhealthy patterns within my culture. And so from one of the ways that we deal with emotions or traumatic events in Asian cultures, or specifically Korean cultures, is that there's this big drinking culture. It's seen as like a glamorous way to connect with your friends and family and all these things, but it's actually a very broken way that my people had to learn how to cope. And so even, boys start drinking at like 10 years old and they just keep going, and every social event had there's drinking involved and just getting completely wasted. And that's kind of how the culture is. And it's seen as a good thing now, but it's a really problematic behavior. Yeah, and there's also stigma towards mental health, right? Asians are told to suppress, and tangible practical needs are more important than the mental. How many of us, if we identify in the Asian American culture, have seen that or heard that from our parents? And even my kind of journey into psychology, my parents, they kind of saw me as a freak. Like, why are you doing this thing? You're like, there's nothing wrong with you. But they didn't understand that, it's of course beyond just a label. Mental health is every part of our lives, right? But it's just the stigma that my parents have. Political, right? It affects us the way that offenses are handled and justice system at large, what laws are put into action, who is, facing the most consequences, those kinds of things. Physiological and biology, right? So we focused a lot on that. Asians feel more negative symptoms in their bodies through headaches, stomach aches, more than emotional weight. That's something that they found. That's culturally consistent in many other minority populations. And also just values and morals, right? Cultural values such as men being stoic and an attitude towards mental health and well-being that is like, you don't need this or you need to be stronger. That is just constantly being told through generations and upheld as expectations. And so what health looks like to different cultures really has a big impact from the generational trauma that we've experienced. And so why is all this important, right? Why is, oh, that's just an example. Why is all this important? It's really thinking about below the surface. So as you guys know, icebergs, Titanic, 10% of an iceberg is above the water, 90% is below, right? And so there's this big bulk, this main thrust of it is below water where no one can see. And so the questions that I have for you, that personal application, is how does this personally apply to you, your family, and your culture? Maybe we've never thought about it in that way in our own selves. Maybe it's like an other problem, but maybe it all affects us in either the extreme historical trauma way or personal, what was my family like kind of way. And we all have a worldview and the way we experience life that is learned and inherited. So something to think about as well. And how have we managed our distress and coped with the wounds within our families? What is your go-to coping skill? Is it avoidance, like Dr. Bland said, or is it kind of directly attacking it? There's ways that we learn to kind of manage the anxiety and the stress that we've inherited and we also just have day to day. And so hopefully this kind of stirs some kind of insight within you. There's awareness, or there's also awareness and introspection to understand why we act the way we do and how we function in our lives. And so the question that I want to throw at you is, what's your history? Right? What's your history? And if there's some things that come to mind, like please write them down and make note. I wanted to kind of show you an example of someone's narrative based on their inherited trauma. I have experienced generational trauma in my own life. I deal with depression and anxiety. This comes from a childhood that included drugs and domestic disputes. I remember the nights I laid in bed trembling because I knew what was going to happen when Dad came home. The trauma I experienced has affected the way I parent my children, interact with my husband, and develop friendships. The history of mental illness in my immediate family has made me wonder if that has any effect on why I have been diagnosed with generalized depression and anxiety disorder. My mother and father were separated most of my childhood and then divorced when I turned 18. I often say I wish they had divorced much sooner. In my own marriage, I tend to have mood swings and not communicate in a healthy way, so some of those maladaptive behaviors, arguing with what I knew and how I thought relationships worked. The way my dad treated my mom and vice versa was all I knew about how two people who love each other should treat each other. So this really distorted view of love or what it means to kind of be in a relationship with someone. These are just a few things I've had to overcome and learn how to do differently. And so this is a very kind of practical day-to-day example we can see in just about anybody we're around, right? And so just continuing why is this important? It fulfills our needs and tends to our wounds. And so the interpersonal experiences that we have may be ruptured or strained because of this intergenerational trauma and way of behaving with one another. And then when you realize that there are some relationships that are just difficult than others, that where it is ruptured and strained, it could be an indication of just the trauma that may be dysfunctional or painful that has happened in your family members. Because I don't know if you're kind of familiar with a genogram, but basically it tracks your family history through like a family tree, and you're able to make connections between who had, strife with who had issues with this other person. And by kind of illustrating it out for yourself and your own family, you can see kind of how it all led down, trickles down. And that's something kind of that I've had to do in school, and it's just really been insightful for me as well. And so, like I said, there is just this fulfilling of our needs and tending to our wounds, these relational wounds that are all in all of us, right? And the attachment issues that are common within traumatized families is a lack of security. So these childhood needs are not meant to develop a healthy sense of self. And that is the basic needs that we needed. We also have hindrances to our God-given capacities and desires. And so I remember being a spiritual director with college students. A lot of them came with a lot of psychological issues that they didn't know how to address. They didn't know how to talk to God in that loving way that they always wanted to, because a lot of it was inherited or influenced by the way they spoke to their families. And so their image of God was really distorted too, because their relationship with their father was broken as well. And so the God-given capacities that we're given, right, they are things like being heard, affirmed, blessed, safe, chosen. These are all things that God gave you to be a fully functioning just child of God. But throughout history, throughout sin, right, we're just constantly lacking those things. But generational sin generational trauma all the more kind of depletes us of these God-given capacities. And so many people with intergenerational trauma have not had their basic God-given desires fulfilled, those ways of being heard, affirmed, blessed, safe, and chosen. It also helps us to understand the discipline of forgiveness, right? This is something that God commands us to do in Scripture, but it is a little cryptic. What does that mean to forgive? How does the Bible portray that? But I think a lot of what I read and just realized through personal experiences were that forgiving is kind of a process that one just needs to encounter, right? The process of brokenness, of healing, of repair, of hurting. And so this kind of develops our spiritual and personal growth of learning how to forgive by going through the process as well. And it also helps us just to be more intentional with the discipline of forgiveness. If this is something God desires for us to do, if it is something that He has modeled for us to do, then it is something that we need to be doing as well. And even if it's not a tangible forgiveness, like someone who wronged us in our direct families, it could trace back farther generations, but there is this forgiveness that is needed regardless. There's repair that is needed across generations. And lastly, just experience healing. So in tandem on the process of confronting, gaining insight, recognizing, we're able to move towards a more cohesive sense of self. And how many of us struggle with our own lovability of ourselves or acceptance of ourselves, or just understanding where we're at mentally and emotionally. But if you break generational trauma and patterns, or kind of attempt to understand, you're understanding yourself, you're understanding who you are as a person. And so talking about trauma is the way to heal, or else the pattern will be perpetuated unless it has an opportunity to heal. So there's an outlet and it's looking for a way to heal, in essence. And so we also need to reprogram our brains to have new experiences that can be ingrained and passed down on the genetic level. Like I said, this is all very ingrained in our biology, our physiological senses. And so we also need to rewire our brain to realize that traumatic symptoms don't have to be the case that's passed down through our generations. Something that kind of brings me hope when I think about this or when I talk about this is Ezra 34:6-7. And so I'll just read it out loud for us. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generations. And so even in this small passage alone, if you look at Scripture as a whole, there's this notion of generational sin, brokenness, and trauma. And this kind of passage highlights that there's iniquity within 3 to 4 generations, but he contrasts it with a steadfast love to thousands. And if you look in your Bibles, there's a footnote, and thousands means thousands of generations, right? And so those who love me and keep my commandments will be kept within thousands of generations. It demonstrates that the massiveness of God's grace to sinners, to whom he forgives and frees, is in the thousands of generations. And it precedes any kind of brokenness that could be passed down generationally, or just a sin that is passed down generationally. And it just abounds. The emphasis is on maximal graciousness of God. And it's a desire that the language of healing and God superseding the idea of generational sin is the message that he has for his people. So where can we begin? Where can we begin as just normal day-to-day people, right? I strongly suggest you reflect on your environment, family history, and just patterns of how you are day to day. Like I said, creating a genogram, family tree, getting in touch with your past, speaking to people who know, grandparents or the years above us. I had to do that with my family. It was a really difficult conversation, but it was enlightening to see my grandfather died because he actually had cancer and it was stress-induced, things like that. It was really enlightening for me to hear and understand. Symptoms, so pay attention to your symptoms, acknowledge your symptoms, pay attention. So not all trauma is inherited, but there are some signs. There's this scholar named Mark Wolin who focuses on intergenerational trauma very heavily, and he says that a great indicator is to notice if there's unexpected fear. Maybe when you hit a milestone in your life that shuts us down or makes us respond with sudden anxiety. So what is this sudden anxiety that's coming up, or this fear when we've hit a milestone in our lives? And it could indicate, it's almost like a breadcrumb that we follow that leads to a trauma that's happened within our families. And so we observe, we learn, and we realize. And when we find the unconscious words in us and link it to the event, we can see the whole picture to explain why we feel the way we feel. We must invite God to this, right? On every part of our trauma. A lot of us, we think this is like the work that we have to do ourselves, but God is right there with us, right? He dwells within us. And what does that mean when we tend to the wounded parts of our hearts? And so I think a practical posture is just to invite him to come with me on this journey. to take time to let him work in our psyche, our minds, and our spirit, all kind of working together, integrated as one. And be kind to yourself. Right? Take time. Avoidance is helpful, like Dr. Bland. I'm getting so much insight from Dr. Bland. But avoidance is helpful, right? There's a reason why we do the things we do, and there's healthy ways that our body have learned to cope with certain things in our lives. And so pay attention to them, be kind, and know that you can't be a superhero one day. It takes a long time, just as long as generational trauma has been passed down. Right? It may be our reality, but it doesn't have to be our destiny. Thank you so much.
We actually have like a few more minutes. So Sally, I don't know, maybe we could just do a little Q&A here, just sort of casually. If there are any questions, people who are here, or if you're watching on Slido, let me get my phone for that. So maybe we'll just, if you have a question, anybody here have a question, you can just raise your hand. Okay, there's one here. Let's see if this is a question. Okay, as an Asian female, after constant exposure to news regarding random acts of violence towards the Asian population, this has made me feel really anxious. What should I do?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, first off, I think gaining access to a therapist or finding that support system is really important. But I think a lot of it, and like I'm emphasizing in my PowerPoint, is that it's really paying attention to the anxiety. Like, what is the root of the anxiety? What is being triggered in you? What do you fear might happen? And kind of gaining insight into that will help you to not only just motivate you to take specific action, but just to get your mind connected to your body as well. And then those are things that you can kind of present to the community around you and find support for. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this has been something that's been hard for a lot of people as we have faced bullying in general, and that we do need a support system. And one of your facts there was that when this trauma happens before the age of 18, it often creates a lot of problems in adulthood. And I know that is something that I've seen a lot. So my question would be, when somebody has experienced a lot of trauma as a child and they just feel like they've been, hurt in a way that is not going to be fixed, but they don't want to hurt anymore and they don't want to end life. They want to find a way of help. So maybe beyond therapy, what are things that people can do to try to stop that downward mental cycle that I'm not worthy, life will always be like this?
I think that kind of sparks like the idea of the learned helplessness that I was talking about, where things have been so rough for an individual where they feel like there's no way out. I don't know. I think each person's journey is so specific, but I think it's maybe identifying with kind of the idea that you've kind of adopted this sense of learned helplessness or this acceptance that things can't get better. And also just to go through it, right? Go through the pain, experiencing, letting it out. I think a lot of people tend to be quick to find coping skills to deal with negative things. But what would it be like for that person just to let out all the things that they're experiencing in a very raw manner, and then be able to then move towards coping or better regulating or just kind of moving forward with their lives? And so I think it is like a very like experiential process in which you just have to go through to get out. And that's kind of what I kind of talk about with my patients as well, this kind of approach to give yourself the time to go through the hurt. Yeah.
Very good, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, Judy?
Ooh,
Good question.
that's a really good question.
The question was, are the traumas that they experience in this situation more genetic? They're born into us, or are they environmental?
I think that I think of the whole nurture nature conversation. As of now, I think more research and more focus has been done on the environmental, how you're raised or what's happening around you socially, psychosocially, but they're realizing that the internal, like the biological things are being affected as well. So it's too early in the research. The ones I referenced were like 2018, 2019. So it's still far to tell, but they're seeing that there's evidence towards it. So for now, I think it's very externally based, and that's kind of where everyone's pointing to.
As a therapist, when you are helping somebody who has gone through this, or they're trying to find their way out, what are hopeful signs that you're getting better?
Hmm. I think an increase of hopefulness. That's actually in every therapeutic relationship. Hopefulness is what kind of motivates or is a telltale sign of that a client will return back. And so there's a better sense of hope. There's also a better self-esteem jump. So they're realizing good things that they like about themselves, and they're seeing that their positive sometimes may outweigh the negatives. Or there's just this shift in the way they see themselves and the world, a more positive view. And so those are kind of the early telltale signs that things are changing for this person. Yeah.
And then finally, when you are working with somebody who has an intergenerational problem, but they themselves are facing other problems in life that aren't related to that, how do you separate them? How do you prioritize them? What do you do first?
I definitely prioritize what's happening right now, here and now. That's most urgent, that's most immediate. And then in some way, there's always an interweaving of kind of the historical or other influences that kind of affect the here and now, which is called the then and there. And so it always makes its way in. But I think first off, what's urgent, what's there is first.
That's
priority.
good advice. Okay,
Yeah.
so we want to take care of things
Yeah.
today
Yes.
before we can worry about yesterday or tomorrow.
Yes, for
Well,
sure.
very good. Well, we're going to take care of things right now by giving you a break.